Hi, and welcome to the Shifting Lens podcast, where we're reviewing the animal experience. Today, we have an amazing, awesome, fantastic guest that I'm so excited to share with you all. Today, we have Dr. Margo DeMello. She is assistant professor at Carroll College in the Anthrozoology Department. And we've invited Margo on today to talk to us about cryptids. And just so I think we're all on the same page, Margo, would you do us the favor of sort of explaining what cryptids are and sort of how that meshes with anthrozoology?
Sure. Cryptids are just hidden creatures. So animals that we either don't know about yet or knew about at one time, and they might still be around, but we're not terribly sure. They're certainly a part of anthrozoology in the sense that cryptids are often, not always, but mostly based in animals, in non-human animals, and maybe even more importantly for us, you can kind of break them down into beasts versus hybrids. And there's just a little bit more of them that are human animal hybrids than they are just quote unquote beasts. So the fact that every culture on the planet has not just a mythology and a set of monsters and creatures that inhabit the supernatural realm, but they also all seem to have those in which those creatures are based in the animal world and seem to have a foothold in the natural world as well as the sort of supernatural world. All of that makes it super, super important for us to look at.
That's so cool. Is there any specific cryptid that you're drawn towards? I'm sure as you read them all and you sort of hear about all these different cultures and their experiences and their creatures out there, what are you drawn to?
I'm both sort of simultaneously drawn to the sort of hyper-local ones, the ones that are very specific to the place and the culture in which they originated. So Bunyip in Australia is kind of right now near and dear to my heart. But then on the other hand, I'm also really intrigued by the universal ones, or, as universal as we're going to talk about right now. So on the one hand, I'm going to say the Bigfoots, which are kind of rooted in the sort of zoological world because they're assumed to be living and real. And then I'm also really interested in mermaids who come from a different world, right? They're the mythological world. Yes, there have been loads of sightings, but most people today have shifted them from the folklore to the myth, or from what we once thought were creatures that shared a world with us into this world of the other. Anyway, so those are kind of the two sort of poles that I'm interested in, is those ones that seem to hit with so many kind of universal themes that we find them in so many other cultures, and then those that are so specific that we couldn't imagine them in another place.
It's so cool. I'm starting to get all these questions, but I don't want to just take over the conversation. Rebecca and Tiamat are also here with us. And do you guys have any thoughts on this? I mean, it's just such a fantastic topic on multiple levels.
Yeah, I mean, I was just skimming through Samantha Hurn's book, talking about cryptozoology in preparation for this podcast. And it just made me think about how, looking through the cryptozoology lens, so to speak, can almost force us to step back or step away from the usual way we look at things, or the usual lens that we have, and question our entanglements perhaps with the natural world, especially now in these kind of these times where we're, the natural world is going through so much that it's almost like one extreme, so that we're sort of thinking in this one extreme. And I say extreme for us sort of in the westernized thought. It's almost like one extreme for us to think that way, to think about mermaids and to think about, Bigfoot, just as an example of one where we think, oh, that surely can't exist. But if we are kind of open to that, maybe when we take that mentality back to our other research that isn't with cryptids, it might open up the way we view it and are more open perhaps to other ways of knowing or other ways of researching. That's sort of what ran through my mind this morning when I just skimmed that chapter.
Well, I think it sort of to respond to that a little bit, I think it makes sense a bit that cryptozoology exploded in the 70s in this in the West, let's say, or in the global North. at a time when we have these other really important social movements emerging that are both about the self, but are also about consciousness about the planet. So we've got, the men's movement and, the gay rights movement and women's movement, but also deep ecology and these other kinds of movements are happening at that time. So we've got sort of a longing for a connection to the wild, and also starting to get a sense of a realization of the losses that we're starting to experience in the very early days of this. And I think that it makes sense then that cryptozoology would really emerge as an important force kind of at that time, certainly in the popular culture, but also, that's kind of where it really took off.
That's so interesting, because I didn't even think about when it started and what the overlaps were. I mean, I'm a child of the 80s where it was like, oh, X-Files and that sort of thing. It was all about the sensationalism, not the intersection that was occurring when we were all sort of trying to find our place at that point. Wow. I'm going to have to sit there and reevaluate the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, this is a lot of speculation. It's also because I wrote about that time period pretty heavily in my own dissertation. And so it's kind of all coming back to me that it makes sense that it really emerged at that time. I mean, as you guys know, there's not a lot of scholarly stuff written on either the community, itself, or the creatures, except in the natural sort of sciences sense. So it's like if, the lens through which it's always typically looked at in our world is, are they real or are they not real? And so let's spend a lot of time now devoting, kind of empirical methods to trying to understand whether these guys are real or not. I'm not so much interested in that, although obviously I would love for them to be real and love for as many of these creatures to be around as possible. But this is to me, that lens is just not that kind of productive for why they're important and why they've captured the imagination. That's why we have to turn to these other lenses, right? So for me, it would be through anthropology and folklore, but on the other hand, we could just as easily go through psychology. We could look at the nature of moral panics and mass hysteria, because we've got to be honest, some of that plays a role in this. So to me, a natural science lens isn't as useful as a social science and also humanities lens to try to understand a little bit more about what's happening here, and to always situate it again in what's going on in the times, because they're clearly, even if the cryptozoologists are always trotting out the kind of the Native American legends, the reality is we're looking at a much more contemporary movement.
I wonder also what, and I don't know anything about this, it's just sort of an open question. I wonder what role religion plays in that as well. And sort of if there are people who are coming from that angle, looking at, I mean, again, I don't know anything about this, but I'm sure that with a lot of these cryptids, people kind of connect something, the devil, or I'm just sort of throwing things out there, but these kinds of connections that are made and the roles that play in their culture. And
if we want to again go to it from a psychological perspective, which I think we have to do at least in part, cryptids, just like sort of the mythological and the folklore creatures before them, tap into our anxieties, right? So sexuality is a huge one. Last night I was immersed in werewolf stuff. I was just watching a bunch of, it's Saturday night, so you get a bunch of horror movies, but I like to try and make sure that they, mesh a little bit. Anyway, so we've got sexuality is obviously an important anxiety. We've got evil, the nature of evil, and then what it is to be human, and how that is defined vis-a-vis what is not human. And then again, the cryptid, especially the hybrids, trouble that issue. So to me, there's just, and also nature, the fear of the wild. So to me, these sort of psychological anxieties, collective psychological anxieties, also play a big role in terms of what monsters emerge and what stories we're telling about them and through them.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I definitely like
Really?
the idea of that hybrid being in a place, in a margin between what we consider to be human and not to be human. And I think one of the things that really has interested me in the past, I would say 10 years or so, it's kind of exploded, is this this fascination with vampire and vampire flicks, and not treating it so much as something to be afraid of, but as something to glorify. And so, like, I'd love to know your thoughts on that, but also I was kind of thinking that speaks to how we view even animals that we know for a fact exist, and how we glorify the experience of that natural. I feel like the way that um, vampires and werewolves, if you look at something like Twilight, for example, have been treated is to kind of put them in that category of fascination for positive reasons as well as for fears. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like the building of that.
I mean, who's the audience for all of those, movies and texts is teenage girls and young women. So, and the vampire and the werewolf both clearly speak to the fears of sexuality, of emergent sexuality. So, again, even though those stories are far, far older, if we just look at when they became popular in horror movies in this country, of course, it was the time when teenagers were emerging as a social force. We've never had teenagers as a consumer group, as an important demographic group in this country before the post-war period, right? And so all of those, the Hammer movies, they came out then, and the Universal monsters, they were then, and and if we take the werewolf in particular, then we think about the ways in which the werewolf then kept being played with. I was a teenage werewolf, which is kind of the most perfect one. You're a teenager, you're going through all these transformations physically and emotionally, and what better way to represent that through, right, the body of the werewolf, who then, as you're suggesting today, has gone from a sort of implicit representation of dangerous teenage sexuality to today to as kind of explicit and on your face as you possibly can be with the Twilight stuff. They're sexual beings, and they're there to, entice the teenage girls. Anyway, that's just, just focusing on just that little part of it.
Fascinating. There's so many angles to come at this from. And
I mean, one of the most, kind of notable of the werewolf cases was the Beast of Gévaudan. I don't speak French, so maybe you can just do one of those crazy leap things right over my voice, because it's so bad. At any rate, so this was 18th century pre-revolutionary France. We have this beast that is, variously described as either just a super huge wolf, or again, a bipedal kind of human wolf hybrid, attacking only women and children. Over 100 villagers were ultimately killed in about 3 years where the beast was active. Only women and children. So you can, on the one hand, just take let's just look at predation attacks. Of course, we're going over with the vulnerable. But that's not how it was played out in the press. The way it was played out in the press was girls and women, even though, of course, there were boys, but it was girls and women. So there was already this sexual kind of overlay to the story that was part of it right from the beginning. And it was one of the reasons why King Louis XVI, who kind of had better things to worry about at this time because his country's around him, sent, highly trained hunters to that region of France. He didn't give a crap about poor people and peasants being killed, but that's kind of an assault on French femininity a little bit, right? That we're allowing this monster to just pick off and allegedly sexually assault. Supposedly some of the bodies were sexually assaulted, which anyway, so yeah, I mean, it turns out his hunter didn't actually do the job. He did kill a wolf, sent it back to Versailles. It stunk up the place because they didn't know how to, taxidermy it right. And anyway, it wasn't even the right animal because he kept being killed after that. And then by that time, things were really bad for him. So he just kind of washed his hands of the affair. But the fact that it rose to the level of his attention, I think, is pretty notable.
there's so much to unpack.
So much.
There's so much to unpack in that.
Well, I saw a documentary. I was watching just a documentary that was talking about the beast, and one of the local people that they were talking to was, it was like 1767, and he was like, He was trying to totally put the whole off as just a media thing, which of course the media, of course, played a role in building the story up, because this was the time when you had those broadsheets and the penny novels and all that business. Anyway, so but what he was saying was, there was nothing going on, and so it was just a big media thing. The media needed to report something on me. There's nothing going on. The king's head is going to be on a spike in a couple of decades, and we're going to be funding the American Revolution, which is already starting, and what? Anyway. But again, it all plays a part. All of it plays a part. The media clearly plays a part in what we think about these animals.
It sort of reminds me of all those conversations about the mountain men and the wolfy, there seems to be that sort of thread going through internationally in a way, in that image of the poor women and this creature coming, and I've been trying to recall what it is that I want to refer to, but I think there's been many situations where they went out to kill this monster or this beastly thing, and they ended up killing a wolf, or
sure,
many cases, yeah.
Yeah,
or other comparable animals, yeah.
Yeah, history is just littered with the bodies of, let's just focus on the chupacabra. How many poor, mange-ridden coyotes and dogs have been killed, because I've seen them, and those are, one woman in Texas has one that's mounted in her living room, and it's it's a mange-ridden coyote, and she has it displayed as a chupacabra in her room. I forgot why I was just mentioning that, though, to relate to what you said. I completely forgot. But at any rate, that obviously the misidentification, intentional or not, clearly results in, the deaths of loads and loads of animals.
Yeah. I think I'm also really fascinated with that the local knowledge of, in many cases where the locals know that these cryptids or just these animals, these living animals exist there, and they might have a really detailed understanding of these animals, and they live amongst them and whatnot. And then you have this science of the all-knowing scientists, but oftentimes I feel like the locals, they surely know more about these animals, right, than someone who's coming in with their spreadsheets and they're wanting to take pictures of everything. But yeah, it's
right.
Except I wish
if we're talking about certain kinds of animals like your wolves, or big cats in other areas, yes, we kind of want to say that the local people have lived a long time for forever. But on the other hand, for animals that have become redefined solely as threats to livestock, and as as Europe changed and the forest became more of a source of fear rather than a place you went for, to get resources, that's going to, not just paint a different picture of those animals, but then again, the local people will have, their relationship with them isn't kind of what it once was.
Yeah. And that would surely also affect it if you're going there to research this, if the locals are having issues that they're feeling like these animals are eating your crops, or there's other conflict going on, or they're coming and bothering your women, or whatever.
Right.
Well, all of that.
Right. And I think part of the local people's response to the cryptid has to do with, so typically when we hear about a cryptid, it's from two things. It's witness sightings of the actual creature, or it's predation, usually dead animals, right? Usually livestock, because that's classic cryptid. It's not so great if your cat has been disemboweled. It's really good if you've got the the dead cow. Anyway, so then your response is also going to be based on that. How much are these animals a threat? They're a threat when you're finding your livestock killed, when it's their appearances, but not a direct threat to you. When you just see, let's say again, the cats, because we have so many witness sightings of the big cats, that tends to, I feel like, do something different with the witnesses. There's more, I think, of an interest and an excitement, and that's when those are the animals who then become either cultural or national kind of icons that tend to represent a locality. However, you don't have that when they're killers. When they kill animals or kill people, then you do not, put statues up, and you don't kind of welcome them as part of your community the way that so many communities have their own, right, little kind of mascot cryptid. That doesn't happen when they're killing you. Maybe if they killed in the past, even right now, by the way, back to the Jevaudet thing in France, if you go there, there is in fact a big bronze of the wolf, but only, this is what's interesting also. So it's a bronze of the wolf with a little girl. I thought that since I'm on a podcast today, he should put the loud dogs in the room with me instead of keeping them in the other room. There's some sort of interesting thing happening in this house.
That's how it works.
Yeah. So anyway, but it's a little girl holding some kind of a spear or something like that, indicating that it's a little girl who killed the beast, which is so interesting because the little girl was part of why we had to be concerned about the beast, was that the beast was eating our girls. And now the little girl has sort of turned around, almost like that statue of the bull and the little girl in, Manhattan on Wall Street. It's very much like that, except 3 centuries before in a very different cultural context.
Fascinating. So in talking about the whole thing about the monster, the beast versus the reverence of certain ones, what is the whole deal with Bigfoots, with humanoid others? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so to me, that almost goes into a total area of its own. So first off, we've got an almost universal belief in a human type of a creature, a human primate type of a creature. So that kind of makes it unique. But the other thing that makes it unique is that, again, I'm going to say this is as flat out speculation. I think that part of what's going on is that the Bigfoot got to take off after primatology or sort of Jane Goodall and Leakey sort of level primatology was mainstreamed enough so that people have this understanding that creatures like this lived in the past. So this, again, the 70s was such an important time for this. This is the time when everybody's grandpa had boxes of National Geographic in their basement. That whole kind of time period, right? Where popular science is really kind of important. And so this is the time, I think, when Bigfoot emerged. So again, part of it has to do with the social movements that are happening at that time, including a very serious concern about, nature. We've got, again, the ecology movement and Rachel Carson and all that kind of stuff that had already started out. And we have an understanding that we're not the only human-like creatures on the planet. And so now there's this kind of intriguing idea that we, at one point, and this is where Neanderthals and a poor understanding of Neanderthals also comes into play, that if we lived at one point alongside of other humanoids, then why couldn't that still be the case today? So to me, that would never have taken off to the way that it has today without the understanding, as often kind of problematic as it is, of not just Neanderthals, but these days they're dragging out the Denisovians, and you know what I mean? They're talking about all of this stuff, the Indonesian hobbits, and as another way to say, look, this has happened in the past. So this is, again, these are the cryptozoologists who, and this is part of that transformation from cryptozoology to just a fringe nut field to trying to make it a real scientific discipline. So that process of legitimacy is actively happening, and it's these creatures that it has its most potential in. I think that probably most cryptozoologists, if you got them, cornered in the, bathroom at the Ramada Inn at the conference, would admit to you that maybe the Mothman, maybe there's not a real one, maybe. But Bigfoot is, I think, a very, very different matter. And again, it's and this is why anthropology has become such an important discipline to the Bigfoot folks, in a way that I think you do not see with the other cryptids,
Is there some, this might be a very, very, very silly question, but is there some overlap with discussions surrounding aliens and these kinds of things with cryptozoology? Is it something that's just sort of on planet Earth, or is it kind of
Yeah, and this is a place
intergalactic.
I probably shouldn't speak to right now because I haven't. So, part of my dream and when I first started this project, it was right before COVID, and I'd already, been planning conventions that I was going to go to, and because I would like to be around cryptozoologists because there's very little at all written on cryptozoologists. Anyways, of course, all that went down the toilet. And so anything that I say about this is speculation. It seems to me that there are shared connections among a number of cryptozoologists. So if you're ever interested in something that's not mainstream, that's something that is either ignored by mainstream science or has been, debunked or, by mainstream science, certainly stigmatized, then you're automatically going to have, right, some suspicion and a little, you're already going to be in an oppositional position vis-a-vis kind of mainstream science. That then often extends to government because government funds scientific research in some cases. And so there's certainly links to these, I think, feelings of suspicion towards authorities, towards those who traditionally control the production of knowledge. And so that is clearly happening in this community at the same time that they want to legitimize themselves and become seen as a scientific discipline alongside the rest of us. Which I think is so fun too, because then that makes the cryptids are obviously already liminal creatures. That's, of course they are, but the cryptozoologists are too, just kind of like we are too. You know what I mean? Because they're lay people, but they want to be seen as scientists with scientific legitimacy. It's, they're obviously in a really, really difficult position. And the fact that they're already, again, speculation, hostile to, kind of mainstream scientific work because of the fact that they're excluded from it, I think makes some sense.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I mean,
again, speculation. I haven't done a single interview with a single cryptozoologist.
But I really love that you went there though, because I think it's sort of the taboo even about talking about it today. It's, oh, we're talking about this thing that's kind of fringe, and isn't it just something that weirdos are into? And it's like, no, actually, but we can look at it through an academic lens, and we can try and bridge that gap and dig around and see what's in there. And I mean, I just love that that's what you're looking at, because you're right. I think, and I think students and anyone else listening to this are like, oh, wow, like that's not off limits. That's something that is, valid, deserves to have people look at it and look at it, without necessarily just trying to say, oh, these are just a bunch of crazy wackos that are trying to dabble in science. So I love it. I think
it is, I think really kind of instrumental and interesting to look at some of the moves that they're doing. Rhetorical moves. What are the disciplines that they gravitate towards? Some people, like just on the Bigfoot front, are all about the locomotion and, have, delved into, again, a legitimate kind of area of science in order to, analyze the tracks and stuff like that. I mean, it's so interesting because the fact that we're trying to use that a lot of cryptozoologists are using scientific methods to try to, drag this creature from the world of folklore into zoology, into the real world. It's very interesting because they're doing that within a context of, we're trying to use scientific methods again to, let's say, analyze a print when that print, we don't have any understanding of how it was created and, and if we're talking about like comparing it to like, say, the criminal justice world, and you've got a chain of evidence and all this kind of stuff that has to happen in order for something to move from evidence to actually being, something that is decent data. And here it's all happening in, and I'm not trying to be insulting here, but kind of a little bit of a fairy world where we're mixing different levels in a way that I think is interesting. We're mixing, on the one hand, again, locomotion and, some scat studies with, Native American legends. So, it's extraordinary how many white cryptozoologists seem to have an understanding of, indigenous folklore. Of course, it's chosen and deployed very specifically for very specific reasons. But it's interesting, again, in a way that science never does, but which I think is super appealing and interesting, because it's sort of what I gravitate towards. It's mixing these different worlds. We're going to explain the existence of a creature partly through the language of natural science, but partly also through the language of folklore, and partly also, and I just think it's an interesting strategy, even if it was never, planned in that way, but it's become a really interesting kind of hodgepodge of different, methods and stories and tools that are all put together in this interesting little stew. That's why I kind of want to, if they're not that expensive, take one of those classes to get a certificate myself, so I can see what that is like, how that plays itself out in the training.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to go through the process of becoming a cryptozoologist and see the methodology that's taught in that context.
I've looked at ghost hunters a little bit, and some of it is sort of the same. The ghost hunters, it seems to me, are engaged in a little bit of that same kind of a move in the same, by the way, exact period of time since the 70s.
Interesting.
And they've got, their kit full of all their scientific equipment and all that kind of stuff, but they have to deploy that alongside of their, folkloric knowledge about ghosts. So you already are combining, methods and tools from two very different worlds into one, and, which is, of course, one of the reasons why, I can't imagine that ghost hunters will ever actually be accepted as any kind of scientists. Because they're doing something that we don't allow.
Would you say, and I understand you haven't, conducted the interviews and all of that yet, but does it come across as if cryptozoology is more of a white space if you look at it from those trying to be more academic? Okay.
Oh yeah. Well, and part of it also, and this is what makes it also, I think, even more interesting, is it's also rural, right? Because cryptids are by definition rural animals, and so the people who find them and the people who study them and the people who see them, the witness reports, everything are, heavily skewed towards rural. So there's just that as just the basis kind of demographic difference. But as we know, that is associated with loads of other differences with respect to beliefs and all that stuff. So absolutely, it's a white space. It's also again, I haven't seen any kind of demographic tables, but I'm going to suggest that it's a conservative space, which is interesting. Also, I'm going to suggest it's a male space, because so many of the witnesses are hunters, and it's that first eyewitness experience that turns one onto the path, right, of becoming a cryptozoologist. And so we have kind of a natural progression from a rural, more conservative, outdoor oriented hunter, that they dominate, right, the field in that way. So that already makes them kind of categorically different sort of from some other groups. Now, the alien stuff seems to me also happens in rural areas. So again, do you have that exact same population? From the surface, it kind of seems like it, but I don't know. But most people don't see aliens in big cities, except on the big invasion, then we're all going to get to see them.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Yeah. So much stuff I hadn't even thought of before, but yeah, quite new to this topic.
I mean, it's fun for me because I watch a lot of TV, because I always have, and I always have done it, and I've always justified it, that saying, well, I do pop culture as part of my research, so I'm allowed to do that. So
there you go.
It's the worst quality horror films about these creatures, but that also is useful, because that's right. It's a representation of, maybe not necessarily that thoughtful, of actual events, but the fact that we wouldn't even have the field of cryptozoology if we didn't have popular culture, they're immediately linked back into each other. So the whole thing plays itself out through the lens of popular culture, which for me justifies them being able to watch all the dumb movies.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm conducting research. This film is for my research. So-
When I was young, this is how old I am. This is how old I am. When I was a grad student the summer, in fact, that I was finishing my dissertation, I would go to 7-Eleven around the corner every morning. No, every Monday morning. It's like 9 o'clock when the People magazines were delivered. I can't believe how lame I was. I would wait at the 7-Eleven for the new People magazine to be delivered because, you know, this was before internet and everything. So that's how I got my gossip. And then I'd run home and I'd read it. And I'd say I was doing research. There wasn't anything I was researching that was in People magazine still.
Yeah, but
It
even
was
before
research.
that,
It
I
was
mean,
research.
it's funny the overlap. You know, I'm growing up in a really challenging adolescence, and I remember my mom would take me to the grocery store and she'd buy me copies of Weekly World News.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, that black and white one with like
Yeah.
Bad Boy and stuff in
Oh,
it.
yeah.
Not because, you know, obviously we thought we were getting anything, you know, scientific out of it, but it was just that voyeurism, that like, let's just look at something that's, you know, completely different.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just kind of even funny how we consume that popular culture when we otherwise don't overlap with it. So,
Right. And again, those tabloids, you know, in this country absolutely played such a major role in the, you know, the rise of this as a phenomenon here. This in Britain, you know, Britain has always had a super vibrant, right, tabloid culture. And so, again, it's not accidental that we have such a plethora of creatures in both of our countries because of this long history of, you know, having a press that is, you know, titillated by this kind of stuff. I mean, Britain in particular, you know, they love their murderers and, you know, that kind of stuff. You know, you go back hundreds of years and find a very thriving industry just on the back of publicizing murders, you know, after they've happened. So it's a good country to have a lot of cryptids, and it makes sense that they have a lot because of that.
I think it's also interesting you brought up the local cryptid, sort of the PR cryptid. Like, I mean, I'm from New Jersey, the Jersey Devil. That's our that's our hockey
Which
team.
is another one that's so hyper localized. It's so yeah.
But I just think about growing up there and then again trying to have that like scientific mind and being like how you could have that duality, be like, oh yeah, a very scientifically minded person, but yeah, Jersey Devil, and like have this anomaly that lives in your reality. And you're like, yeah, that's normal. Like, what?
So are there though like statues and billboards and fun things of the Jersey Devil around that area?
Somewhat. There's definitely tchotchkes. Like you go down to South Jersey and it's the whole like, oh, he's in the Pine Barrens with the Pineys. And again, there's that sort of idea that he's seen mostly by the poor, you know, population that lives in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So we culturally have that. But then, yeah, I mean, besides the hockey team, I believe there's some statuary stuff, but there's even one of the interesting things about New Jersey is I grew up with this magazine called Weird New Jersey. And the whole purpose of it was all the weird roads and the hyper like weird phenomena in the state and like super fun sites and like all the odd things that existed in the state, all the abandoned things, all the sightings, all the ghosts. Right. It's interesting, we even had a publication dedicated to that in a state that goes from very rural up to, you know, very, very industrial city type scape. So yeah, it's just fascinating how all that can happen in just such a small state in a microcosm that's
right.
You know, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And which communities really embrace their local cryptids and use it as a part of kind of that whole telling a story about ourselves versus which of them are kind of a little ashamed of it. Seems to me that I've just noticed that more communities are starting to embrace them these days, whereas I think there was a lot of shame associated with them early on. But now, you know, like with the Mothman and stuff, you know, and because that one really is associated with real death. I mean, you know, again, according to the legend, you know, some serious deaths, but 50 years, 70 years later now, it's a fun thing. It's a fun thing for the whole town because presumably all the people who remember the deaths aren't around anymore.
That's true. You can't go into a Scottish shop without some representation of Nessie there.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been, but, you know, I can see them everywhere and yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting.
So my hometown, it's on a lake in like southeast Ontario. We actually have a Loch Ness Monster cousin, as we call it. Kempenfelt Kelly is our
Oh, I
version
haven't
of
heard of that
Nessie.
one.
Wow, I hadn't
Yeah,
either.
so she's not really well known outside the area. And I mean, I grew up here and it wasn't until my 20s that I learned about her. I just thought that we had these cute little like sea monster toys on the beach near the kids area and never really thought anything of it. I was like, well, that's cute because we're on a
Oh,
lake. But it wasn't until a couple years ago, yeah, about 5 years ago, I'm looking at the article. There was this article that came out talking about the sightings, and there was a sighting of this 12-foot creature in the lake, but there aren't any good photos from the sighting. So it's
yeah,
just stories. But it
yeah,
was interesting because like you're talking about hyperlocalities, and in a lot of cases, something like Loch Ness, even though it's local, and the Jersey Devil, it's local, there's still knowledge about it outside the area. And I
right,
feel like my little tiny lake in Barrie, Ontario, that hasn't spread. So I guess
right,
I'm interested in how those hyperlocal stories
right.
become popularized.
Well, with the serpents, the lake serpents, so it might be slightly different yet again, though. So part of it, I think, is that most countries and continents have massive lakes, and so when there's a really big lake, it's dark and you don't know what's underneath it and all that, then of course we're going to expect there's going to be myths associated with it that are going to be explaining what's underneath it. How they all turned into a remarkably plesiosaur-like, creature, all of them, almost all of them across the board. Is it a case of sort of convergent evolution in terms of our, myths? Is that what's happening? Or is it, I kind of feel like for some of them, is that the Loch Ness Monster then became kind of globalized. Now, and I'm not saying that Madembe Mabelli and, all these other local sea monsters didn't exist before Loch Ness, but I think they didn't take on their present day characteristics. Again, this is speculation at this point. A lot of this really is, but so your monster is hyper, localized, but I also guarantee you that your monster is part of, this traffic in sea serpent and lake serpent, creatures, in particular in terms of the appearance. I mean, the appearance of them is so specifically to the plesiosaur. Now, of course, then your other explanation for that is that we in fact do have plesiosaurs that survive 66 whatever million years in every major lake on every continent. Maybe I'm not sure that that's going to be the case, but yeah. So that's another thing too, that there's just so many just rich areas, is just just to make your whole project be the transmission of lake serpent narratives and how they move and how they change and stuff like that, would be terrific.
I think that's really what interests me about this local one for me is I mean there's no photography, and in a lot of cases like you have photographs out there of Nessie, but you don't have photographs of Kelly. And so I wonder if one day there was this marketing pro who got, employee of the month for it, for being like, guys, we're a tourist city. We have a Nessie too now. What should we call it?
Well, that's
And
the
so I
other thing.
wonder how much of it is just marketing pull off of one or two localized myths.
And especially because when we're talking about lakes, what are lakes but tourist draws? They absolutely are. And so I forget whether it's Champ or Obi-Gobi, but another North American sea serpent, that the mayor of that town offered, like, I don't know, $1 million reward for anybody who could bring in evidence of it. Another North American one, there is a law on books that says that you cannot harm her. I forget which one that is too, but you can't harm her. So these are tourist towns. There's just no question that, again, the large lakes both provide the physical environment for myths about, creatures, unknown creatures to emerge. But then in the, modern world, those same lakes are now host to tourists from all over the place. And so absolutely, if we go back to the most well-known of all the lake monsters and the tourism that draws, why wouldn't you, if you're a tourist guy in some whatever place, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, this has been awesome, Margo. Does anybody else have any more questions to round this up?
Actually, no, it's been absolutely fascinating.
I know. I feel like I've just opened a box of goodies and there's just so many thoughts
Yeah.
to unpack. This is so cool.
I know.
Thank
I'm
you
sure
so
I'm
much.
gonna think of questions like after we've left too. Like there's so much to explore now.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure there'll be a part 2. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
This has been so fascinating. Your expertise is excellent. I mean, just all the different dimensions you've articulated today is just so neat. And for somebody who maybe has heard of cryptozoology, but not heard of anthrozoology, at least can sort of see where the overlap can be and possibly use one of these avenues as well to examine it. So that's super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of the Shifting Lens podcast, and we look forward to having you next time.